Pleased to be joined tonight by a guy that you may not recognise. He worked behind the scenes at the Hammers for just under a year, and I'm pleased to speak to him tonight. Hopefully get an insight into what goes on behind the scenes at West Ham United. Gary, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. How's things with yourself?
Yeah, all going well, thank you. Yeah, all good.
May 2017, you arrived at West Ham, you're appointed head of medical services. How does that kind of appointment come about from a football club? Who is it that contacts you, etc.?
Well, at the time, I was working privately and just doing private work. I had left the Football Association the year before and wanted to get back into football, but obviously there wasn't an opportunity there. And then I had a phone call from Slaven Bilic asking if he could meet me, and which I did. And he spoke to me about the possibility of taking the role. And then when we agreed that I could do it, then it was passed on to the club to sort out the 1 year fixed term contract.
What was it that Bilic spoke about? What was it exactly that made you decide that West Ham was the club that you wanted to get back into football with?
Well, he spoke to me about what he thought the medical team should be made up of and how it should work. He spoke to me in great detail about how he worked and about the setup at the club. I had discussed with him the way I'd worked previously, who I'd worked with. Obviously, he'd done his due diligence and he'd spoken to people that I'd worked with, people like the Vice Chairman at Arsenal, David Dean, Arsene Wenger, Roy Hodgson. And so between us, we thought it was the right fit. And he only had 1 year left on his contract. So the club had agreed to give me a 1 year fixed term contract that would run out at the same time that Slaven's contract ran out.
How was it working under Bilic? Obviously, you replaced someone that was sort of a friend of Slav. You replaced Dijan, who went to Holland to pursue other career interests. But what was it like working under the guidance of Slav?
No, it's very enjoyable. It's like most managers. I've been in the game long enough to know that you have to change the way you work slightly to work with your manager. I enjoyed working with him. It was a great relationship. Him and the backroom staff were really, really good. The medical staff we had in place at the time, I'd known over the years, and they welcomed me into the club. And so we slowly went about trying to change a few things, how the club worked, trying to improve the facilities behind the scenes, because they'd only recently gone into Rush Green. And so it was a relatively new training ground. Wanted to change the mentality of how the club worked with injuries and how the players worked towards injuries. So it was going to be a long-term project. Unfortunately, it only lasted a year, but I'd like to think we'd made a few inroads into it.
You just spoke there about changing a few things, i.e. mentality, etc. What was it you tried to change? Could be quite interesting to know what the old mentality was and what you tried to change it into.
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons I learned working with Arsene Wenger and people like Sven-Goran Eriksson and Fabio Capello is changing the mentality of players of, instead of it coming into a workplace, they actually take over the control of and their responsibilities of what they need to do themselves as professional footballers. We had a really good squad last year that were very conscientious and worked very, very hard. So what we had to put in place was things that made things available for them to be able to come in and be the professionals that they were. So some players would come in very early before training and do a lot of prehabilitation. Some players had programs they did after training. When they were injured, incorporating into an afternoon sessions and working a lot harder. So I don't think it was a change of anything. I think it was just remodelling what they already had there.
You spoke about how you sometimes have to adapt to different managers there. Was there anything about Bilic that was unique to Slav that you had to change personally in order to fit what he wanted?
No, I think Slaven was really good to us, and he allowed us to get on with the medical side of things. And it was the communication. The biggest adaptation you make when managers change is the lines of communication. How do they want you to communicate with them? What boundaries do they put in place on what information you give them? Do they want everything? Do they want selected pieces of it? Or is it a case of can they train, can't they train? And that's all they want to know. So every manager is completely different. Some managers like to know absolutely everything. Some managers like to just be given all the important information so that they can make the right decision without being bombarded with too much information.
What kind of manager was Slav in regards to how much information he wanted?
Slaven was he was a typical foreign coach in that he would like information and he would like decisive information. Can they train? Can't they train? When will they be available? Can they play? He didn't want, well, if we do this, they might be able to join in on a certain day, or they might make the game. He liked people to make decisions. And it was a thing that I found with foreign managers. They very much were like that.
It's interesting that you were Slav's choice, because obviously, even up until now, I wasn't too sure Sturgeon was sort of dismissed by the club, because the season before you arrived, there was a lot of question marks over the fitness of players, because a lot of fans felt that the players weren't covering as much ground. Well, statistically, they were covering the least amount of ground in games in comparison to other Premier League clubs. Is there anything you had to change or implement at the club when you arrived in order to improve players' fitness, or was players' fitness even an issue when you came in?
Well, fitness is a very vague statement, because if you're not medically fit, you're not going to get fit. And I think this is the lines of engagement, if you want for a better phrase, where Slaven had his own fitness staff who were in charge of the day-to-day training. The medical team were in charge of having the players physically ready to do the training that Slaven and his staff wanted. So it was important for myself, who hadn't worked with him before, to know what kind of training they did, how they worked, and what was he expecting from his players in training. When you know that, you know the parameters that the players have to work in, so you can decide, are they fit to train or aren't they fit to train? So I don't think it was a case of trying to improve players' fitness. I think it was a case of making the environment ideal for players to be ready to train to the levels the management wanted them to.
And then near enough halfway through the season, just short of halfway through the season, there was obviously a managerial change at the club. Slaven and his staff were dismissed, and in came David Moyes. How different was it to working from one manager to David Moyes, who we know is quite hands-on, if you like?
It's always different. As I said before, all the managers have their own approaches, plus all their backroom staff. So David came in with Stuart Pearce, Alan Irvine, Billy McKinley. So they had a completely new coaching staff as well, all of which will want to work very differently to how Slaven worked. So you're starting the same process that I discussed earlier with Slaven. You're starting that process again. The difference is when you do it during the season, you're doing it whilst you're working, whereas under Slaven, you had a pre-season to get used of how they wanted to work. One thing you would say is that whenever you change a manager and a style of play, it does affect the number of injuries you have. And statistically, a common denominator for increase of injuries is always a change of management, because players are changing the way they train, the way they play. With David, I don't think it went too badly. I don't think we had the sudden rise in injuries. But obviously the players had to change in the way they were asked to play and the demands put on them. The other thing that you mentioned before about is distance covered by players. That's a very, very false way of measuring how fit players are, because it really depends on the game. I mean, if you look at teams abroad like Barcelona or Real Madrid, the distance they cover won't compare, because they're 4, 5, 6-0 up at times. You could be chasing a game. If you're chasing a game, you're going to run more. If you're sitting back defending a lead, you're not going to run quite so much. So the distance covered is not a great indicator of how fit you are.
Excellent. And how was it working under Moyes? Was it from your medical standpoint of view?
Well, I enjoyed working with him. He reminded me of George Graham, who was my first manager in football. Very disciplined, very organised, very methodical, but you knew what he wanted. Obviously, I'd worked with Stuart Pearce at the Football Association for many years, so I knew Stuart really well. I'd met Alan Irvine on the football circuit and Billy McKinley on the football circuit, but not actually directly worked with them. I actually thought he was a very, very, very good backroom staff. We worked very, very hard and very, very well. Obviously, we stayed up and then we finished mid-table in the end, although it went quite late in the season. So, yeah, they were nice people to work with. Towards the end of the season, when we knew we were safe, obviously there was a little bit of uncertainty because nobody knew whether any of us were staying because all our contracts are up. So that makes it a bit unnerving, and the uncertainty isn't very nice.
Does it affect you as the backroom staff? Does it affect you when your contract's coming to an end and you're unsure what the future holds for you?
I think it affects everybody that's in work. That if you don't know whether you're going to have a job in a couple of weeks' time, I was notified, I think it was about 7 or 8 days before my contract ran out, that they weren't renewing it. So that's a life change, because you're reliant on your wages, you're reliant on your working relationship and your work, and then suddenly that changes. So you have to move on to the next thing. So I think during the season it doesn't affect you, but once the season finishes, then it does affect you, because obviously everyone has a mortgage to pay.
Yeah. Let's go back to May 2017 when you arrived. What was your first impressions of Rush Green when you walked in?
Well, I knew West Ham very well, because my cousin Trevor Lewin works in the academy. He's worked there for about 30 years. And I knew a lot of people at West Ham. And I was born in East Ham, so all my family West Ham fans. I rebelled as a kid and supported Arsenal. And I used to go to my first ever professional matches were Upton Park. And it was always a familiar place to go to. So I knew Chapel Heath really well. I'm old enough to remember playing at Ford United, which is the Rush Green training ground. And it hadn't changed a lot from those days, I must admit. But it was work in progress. I mean, West Ham had purchased a site, they modernised it, they moved into it quite quickly. And as far as I know, they've made a lot more changes since I've left as well. So it's an ongoing project that the club are investing a lot of money into Chapel Heath, into Rush Green, to bring it up to the standard they're looking for West Ham.
When you arrived, from your impression, from a medical standpoint, would you say it was adequate for a club of West Ham size and stature?
Yeah, I do. I think they had a good team. They had the facilities they had needed to be improved, but the club knew that, and that was an ongoing investment they were going to continue to do. Staff-wise, staff numbers were very good. They had enough medical staff to look after the players that were needed. I thought the setup there was really good, and I was quite excited to become part of it.
Obviously, you talk about the ongoing project, just how much is needed. I know you can't really put like a measurement on it in terms of finances, etc. But is there a lot of work needed to bring up to the standards of, say, Arsenal, or even the England where you were more recently with before you joined West Ham?
Well, let me put it into context. The St George's Park at the FA, that cost them £110 million to build. The training ground at Arsenal, they've spent over £100 million on that. Tottenham has spent over £100 million on their training ground. Man United upgraded their training ground 2-3 years ago. They spent another 25-30 million on it. Arsenal put a new performance wing on their training ground last year, spent another £25 million. So it's an evolution, and all training grounds have to evolve over a period of time. Now, some clubs do it in one hit. Other clubs build up the momentum depending on how the team is doing. Because you can spend that sort of money on a training ground, and if you have a really poor season, or say they got relegated, that's bad business, because you've invested a lot of money and you're getting no return. So I think it has to be an evolution, and I think that's, from my point of view, that's what the club are trying to do. They're evolving the training ground to bring it up to standard of other top Premiership clubs. And I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm sure that is the aim of the board, a bit like the London Stadium, to bring it up to being a top Premiership side.
I'd like to talk to you about a couple of individual players at West Ham United before we're going back to a more broader topic. Andy Carroll's the first one. I would say he's joined West Ham. He's had a lot of injuries during his time, before your reign, during your reign, and after your reign at West Ham. What's your opinion on Andy and why he sort of gets so many of these injuries?
It's a very complex question to answer. There are a lot of players like that in football. Andy's a very conscientious person. He works very, very hard at all aspects of his game. He just wants to play football. And he gets quite upset and is devastated when he's out injured. Unfortunately, some players do pick up injuries, and it's like a domino effect. They pick up one nasty injury, they recover from it, then they pick up another one, and they don't ever seem to get out of that cycle. And unfortunately for Andy, I think he's been in that cycle at West Ham. And every time he comes out of it, you hope that's the end of it. And thankfully, he's back playing now, and he looks fit. He now needs games. But obviously, with the team doing quite well, it's difficult to get games when the people that are in your place are playing so well. So, as I said, you get them a lot of clubs. that where players do get injured, that it's sometimes difficult to get out of that one injury after another. And I think as soon as Andy does, then he'll get back to the player he was.
In other interviews from ex-professionals elsewhere, some people that have played with Andy have indicated that his off-the-pitch lifestyles might not necessarily help in terms of staying fit. Craig Bellamy is one of them that sort of said that Andy's lifestyle away from the football club is probably a reason that he has these injuries. From a medical point of view, is that something you would agree with, or do you disagree with that completely?
Well, I can only talk about the year that I spent there last year, and the year that I was there, I would disagree. Off the pitch, he was very, very professional. He looked after himself. He seemed to be doing the right things. He seemed very settled outside of the club. And he was as frustrated as anyone when he wasn't playing. So I personally would disagree with that. I don't think he was doing anything that was detrimental to him becoming fit.
Winston Reid's another player. Now in March, just before you left, Winston Reid picked up a knee injury. He's still injured to this day. It's just coming short of a year since he picked up. Can you give us any insight into what the problem is with his knee and how long we're perhaps looking at? I believe there was a knockback sort of after you departed. We got told that he was going to require a certain operation. The club put a timeline of 3 months on it, but those with sources at the club, if you like, knew that it was going to be a bit longer than that. So he's been out for nearly a year. What can you tell us about Winston Reid?
Not too much. Obviously, I can't discuss about individual injuries. I can only talk about the person. And he was very unlucky. If you remember, the initial injury was when he was knocked out at Swansea, and his knee buckled underneath him when he was unconscious. And so he had quite a nasty head injury, and he was unconscious when his knee buckled. So he had surgery on his knee to correct a problem with his ligament. Now, as with any kind of surgery, sometimes complications set in. And what I can gather is that during the rehab from the injury, the knee becomes swollen again, and obviously they took another look and found out there was another problem going on. I had left by then, so I really don't know what had gone on with that. But what I would say is this happens. These are professional athletes, and there's never any certainty with any kind of surgery to a weight-bearing joint. And I think, unfortunately, Winston's gone through that now.
Now for the killer question. West Ham fans have been watching this so far. We're thinking, come on, Gio, ask him. Gary, for years, West Ham have had injury problems. We're always top of the table for injuries over a season. Right now, I know you're not there, but right now, for example, we are still top of that table. We were there last season as well. Is there a reason in particular that you think might be contributing to all these injuries we have at West Ham?
The first thing I would say is I would argue about statistics. Because I would ask the question, where do these statistics come from? Now, most of these statistics come from a forum called physioroom.com, and they basically record injuries that are reported in the press. So if you've got a club like West Ham who are very open with the press and very open with the information they give to their fans, every single injury will be recorded. There are clubs in the Premier League, and I looked at physioroom.com was published on Sky last week, and there was 2 clubs in the Premier League who they claim have only had 4 injuries this season. No club on earth has ever only had 4 injuries in a season. So the first thing I would say is there is no official audit of injury in the Premier League. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, and I think there should be. I tried to bring it in when I worked at the FA, but the Premier League wouldn't do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, okay, yes, they have had a lot of injuries, and notoriously over the years they've had a lot of injuries. I don't think there's any single one factor. I know there's been speculation in from fans forums about, is it the training ground, is it the ground? What I would say is, statistically, you do get more injuries if you are changing training surfaces regularly or match surfaces regularly. Personally, I don't think that applies to West Ham because they've been in the training ground for over a year now. They were at Chadwell Heath before that. So I don't think that's the case. How you define or how you actually sort of legislate why they get so many injuries, it is a very, very difficult thing to answer. Often the biggest cause or the biggest instance of injury is previous injury. So again, I would look at the players that they've got. A lot of them have had a history of injuries over the years. And so that doesn't change. And I think if you look at other clubs, I was at Arsenal before, and I know Arsenal have had a reputation of having a lot of injuries. In some of the things I've seen last week, Man United were high up the scale. Liverpool are really suffering with injuries at the moment. There's no reason for it. One thing I would say is, again, change of manager. That can cause an increase of injury. So there are so many variable factors that I don't think you can actually point down to any one thing. And I would argue all day long, there's nothing the club are doing wrong. In the year that I was there is nothing they are doing wrong that you would say, actually, they could improve this if they did A, B or C. I don't think that's the case.
Interesting. Well, you talk about some players that are injury prone, lightly. Now, one player West Ham signed this summer. Now, I'm aware he made his debut at Arsenal months after you left, so you never actually overseen Jack Wilshere. However, your cousin's been there. What's his name? Is it Colin? Is Colin his name? Colin's obviously been at Arsenal as long as Jack has. Were you consulted by West Ham? Because we were obviously looking at Jack, before the season ended, while you were still at the club. Did anyone at West Ham ask you about your opinion on Jack Wilshere's injury history?
No, not at the end of the season. They didn't. I wasn't involved in. If you remember, they were in the process of changing the management, changing the chief scout. Obviously, Pellegrini came in with his own backroom staff, and that all happened in the weeks leading up to when I left. So I had no conversation with anybody at the club about that.
Do you have any opinion? And similar to what I asked you about Andy Carroll, is Jack Wilshere just one of those players that's unfortunately always just going to be fragile, if you like?
Well, I think your injury record or your playing record does speak for itself. And if you do take a player on that has had so many injuries, then the risk of him getting another injury is higher than other players. You can't deny that fact. But when you're looking at the calibre of player that you're trying to buy and what he can bring to the team if he's fully fit, that's the risk management that you take when you do a medical, when you sign a player.
When you were there for 2 transfer windows. Do you get consulted? This is just a general question. Do you get consulted as the head of medical before we approach a player to sign? Do you get asked your opinion from a medical standpoint on that potential signing?
Not very often. What tends to happen is the club will highlight players that they are going to try and bring to the club. Occasionally you might get asked to do some background searching for the player, but that's not very often. Normally you get a call to say that this player is coming in, we need to do a medical on him. That's the time when you do your medical background check. So you'll look at his playing record, his previous injuries, you'll do some research on online. You might even speak to the club that are actually selling him, assuming that they know that he's being sold. And so that's when you do your due diligence during the medical.
Interesting. Was there anything you'd go back and change now? Now you've left West Ham, is there anything you look back at your time and think, I wish I'd done that differently, or I wish I'd done this differently?
Some longer contract? No, not really. It's a difficult thing when you go into a new role, into a new club. You wanna evolve things. You don't want a revolution. You want an evolution. Would I have done anything differently? In hindsight, I think you look at a lot of things and think maybe I could have done that slightly better. We could have done that slightly differently. But overall, I would say no. I had a really enjoyable year at West Ham. They're a really good club. There's some really good people working there. And I was really disappointed when I left because I really enjoyed my time there.
Fantastic. Well, Gary, last question. What's next for the life and career of Gary Lewin?
At the moment, I'm looking to set up a clinic with my cousin, Colin, who left Arsenal in the summer, and we're going to set up a private practice in Essex. And I think that'll be for me. I don't think I'll go back into football full time. I might do some consultancy work, but I think I will just go into private practice now and then just go back and watch the games whenever I can.
Well, Gary, thank you very much. I thoroughly appreciate coming on, your insight into West Ham and why we have so many injuries. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Nice to speak to you.
If you've enjoyed the video at home, make sure you drop a like on it. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. Leave your comments below what you thought of our chat with Gary and his insight into Jack Wilshere, Andy Carroll, and the ilk that we have discussed. Thank you very much. We'll catch you on the next video.